Your posture is atrocious. Your grip lacking. Wyatt, are you trying to fail on purpose? If so, you are a master at deception, for even I am left stunned at your terrible performance, Cynthia commented as she paced around the sweating pilot holding a sword precariously in his hands. It was a regular plasma sword used by the Marines, but no matter how many times she instructed him in the proper ways to hold it, what posture to take, and how to make a basic swing, Wyatt failed spectacularly at every turn. "I told you!" Wyatt protested, groaning as his arms ached from swinging the, thankfully, deactivated sword over his head to hit a training dummy with a strong but amateurish strike. "I'm not good with melee weapons." The sword itself weighed 3 kilos and had a sharp edge that ran alongside the pristine silver-colored blade. The hilt was big, necessary since it housed the power source to activate the deadly plasmic effect that superheated the sword's edges to the point that very little could withstand a single swing from the deadly weapon. Flashbacks of his early days in the academy trying out weapons to gauge his potential in other areas passed before his eyes, and how he nearly decapitated an instructor with a plasma sword that had slipped from his hands. That went without remembering the many bruises he gained when trying to wield other weapons, such as knives, daggers, and a mace on one occasion. After that near-fatal incident, he had been all but barred from ever touching a melee weapon ever again. Somehow, his next swing missed, and he ended up losing his balance and nearly stumbled forth to crash against the dummy. The sword clanged against the floor as he released a frustrated and tired exhalation. "Have you learned nothing these past weeks?" Cynthia asked, as she looked on with disappointment at the poor display the pilot had showcased ever since their training evolved. "I've learned that I should not be allowed to wield these weapons," he protested, showing his frustration as he angrily tossed the sword to the ground. "I'm not a close-quarter combatant." He also wanted to shout that her trying to train him with a sword was pointless, that she was wasting her time, but he bit his tongue at the end. When their training changed from her beating him into the ground continuously to instructing him on how to take advantage of his movements, teach him how to control his field of awareness, and what postures and stances were best for various situations, he had been thankful. But training how to wield a melee weapon was far, far worse. He tried his best. He really did. But he simply had neither talent nor skill in that regard. Cynthia hummed deeply, frowning. "How is it possible that you have a tangible talent in hand-to-hand combat, but the moment you touch a weapon you have the grace of a fish out of water?" she asked, shaking her head in disapproval. "You must learn to fight with a sword, Wyatt. You're a noble now. If you are challenged to a fencing duel or some other duel requiring you to use a weapon, you will be defenseless if you do not learn at least the basics." Wyatt breathed heavily for a few seconds before picking up the sword. Turning to the blue-haired woman, he frowned. "Then let's just stick to the basics. It is more than obvious I'll never be a master swordsman like you, Cynthia. I just need to learn how to hold it and hit someone with it, since I'm only ever going to use them against nobles. You may be a pilot, but you've encountered yourself in various situations placing you in peril. I will not have you become a subpar part of my princess's entourage, no matter how skillful you may be as a pilot and, by Milkady's estimate, a good shooter," Cynthia replied firmly. At the mention of Clara, Wyatt suppressed a sudden pang of frustration but got over it quickly. He would have a word with Clara later, in private, without Cynthia to hear them. It wasn't as if he distrusted the red-armored woman, but he needed to speak with Clara and Clara alone first. Gripping the hilt, he turned in full to face Cynthia. "Maybe I need to be pressured into a more deadly situation," he proposed. As much as he disliked fighting, the thrill of battle always brought forth a concentration and level of focus unrivaled under any other circumstance. "Perish the thought," Cynthia shook her head. "You would not last more than a second against me even if I held back. Besides, my sword grants me an unfair advantage." "Just your sword? Woman, please, I've seen you fight before." "You are the unfair advantage," Wyatt thought, raising an eyebrow, a shudder running down his spine as he remembered just how deadly Cynthia was, and more so the fact that he had yet to see her completely unleashed. "You don't believe me?" Cynthia asked, taking his expression as a sign of doubt. Before he could reply, she reached for her sword and removed the magnetic lock keeping her sheath attached to her back. With a slow but elegant motion, she drew her sword, revealing the dark, silvery metal and the red hilt forming a cross. The crossguard, or quillons, as Cynthia described them, were spread wings. It was a beautiful weapon, and it occurred to Wyatt that it was the first time he'd paid it any real attention. Instead of taking a stance, Cynthia approached him and turned the sword upside down, grabbing it by the grip, near the pommel with just her thumb and index finger curled around it. Wyatt understood the gesture and put his sword down before gripping the sword's hilt tightly. He saw Cynthia smile a mischievous smile before suddenly letting go of her sword. Oof! Wyatt let out a surprised groan as his arm was dragged downward by the unexpected weight of the sword. His arm, shoulder, and chest muscles tensed, and he heaved and clenched his teeth, quickly adapting to the ridiculous weight and avoiding dropping it to the ground. After a few seconds of unflattering groaning, he gripped the hilt with both hands, finally able to bring it up to his chest. He stared at the weapon, then looked at Cynthia, then at the weapon, then back to Cynthia with utter bewilderment. "You carry this all the time?" was the only thing he could manage to say. "Always," Cynthia replied, her smile never faltering. "How heavy is it?" Wyatt asked, his arms starting to shake. Even if he wasn't already tired, he knew he could never manage to use the heaping piece of metal Cynthia called a sword in any way even remotely effective. Hell, he doubted he could swing the thing without it tumbling him to the ground. Even with his now enhanced strength, Cynthia's sword was incredibly heavy, especially given its size. It was no bigger or thicker than a regular longsword. If he had to take a guess, from tip to bottom, it barely reached past 1.30 meters in length. Just what is this thing made out of? He thought with unease. 18 kilos with the power source, 15 without it. I always keep it ready for combat, Cynthia replied, and her smile widened a bit more when Wyatt's face blanched. To her credit, the blue-haired woman only let out a single throaty chuckle of amusement before continuing. "Do not fret, for only I can activate my sword. It is genetically linked for my exclusive use, and unlike the sword you were wielding, it does not have a hand trigger." Wyatt nodded at her explanation, not knowing what else to do. Seeing his struggle, the red-armored woman gripped the blade, and the weight almost vanished instantly. Letting go of the grip, Wyatt took a step back as Cynthia, seemingly stricken by a moment of fancy, seamlessly twirled her sword around a few times with one hand, handling it with such ease that it made the blade's weight utterly meaningless in her hands. "Unfair advantage?" he asked, finding his voice. "How are you able to use that thing you call a sword like that? How strong are you, Cynthia?" "Very strong," was her simple reply. "My numerous genetic upgrades, implants, and alterations have granted me such strength and more. In essence, I am a living weapon," said the blue-haired bodyguard without shame or disdain. "Proud protector of Clara Astor and a proud Winfield." "I see," Wyatt replied, not sure what else to say. Her conviction was true and clear, her words were sincere, and her eyes shone with pride with every syllable that parted from her lips. It resonated with him on a personal level. Her conviction, such dedication. It was clear she knew her place, and she took satisfaction in it. Nobles, commoners. "We're all just people underneath our armor and behind our masks," Wyatt thought as an invisible weight fell from his shoulders. He always knew that was the case. Commoner or noble, they all bled red. But this was the first time he understood something so basic, primordial even. Picking up his sword, he was ready to continue with his lesson when Cynthia placed a hand on his shoulder while the other locked her sword on her back once again. "This will be enough for today, Wyatt. We shall arrive at Balakura in the coming hours. Go and rest. As part of my princess's entourage, you must be presentable." "Very well," Wyatt agreed, paused for a moment, and then spoke up. "Cynthia, why do you train me? Am I to become another bodyguard for Clara?" Cynthia stared at him for several seconds, then shook her head and offered a sincere, warm smile. "In a sense, yes. But largely? No," she said, and then turned to leave without saying another word. Wyatt stared at her for long moments until she left the arena. He then stared at the sword and decided to return it to the armory, but as he was about to step out of the arena, 2 staff members respectfully blocked his way and bowed their heads slightly. "We will return it, my lord. You can rest easy," said one of the staff. The pilot-turned-knight felt his stomach churn at being referred to as Lord. It wasn't the first time, but it never failed to make him uncomfortable. I wonder if I'll ever get used to it, he thought, silently handing the sword to the one who had spoken. Another respectful bow of their heads, and they were on their way to carry out their duties. Shaking his head, he continued on his way back to his quarters. After taking a shower and putting on fresh clothes, he stepped out of his shower only to find a Royal Marine standing in the middle of his room with a pitch-black suitcase resting next to him. His heart skipped a beat and his muscles clenched tight, but when he felt no hostility coming from the Royal Marine, he relaxed and took a step forward. "Can I help you?" he asked, uncertain. The Royal Marine said nothing as he reached for his helmet, and with a hiss of pressurized air removed it. It occurred to him that he'd never seen any Royal Marine without their helmets on, and was surprised when he saw the white hair and the fiery orange eyes set on the rather handsome man before him. He had never seen his face before, but the name left his mouth all the same. "Captain Milcades?" Wyatt asked, hopeful and surprised in equal measure. "Please, Wyatt, just call me Milcades. We are in privacy," the white-haired man replied. Wyatt nodded and came to stand in front of the captain, his gaze holding an intensity to them that was both searing and playful. "What may I do for you, Milcades?" "First, let us sit, for I bring many gifts, both physical and in words," he said, and promptly sat down on Wyatt's bed. The bed groaned as the Royal Marine sat down, protesting against the weight set upon it. Seeing no reason to decline, Wyatt joined him and sat next to him, leaving a sizable gap between them. Wordlessly, the captain reached into one of his small, sealed belt satchels and pulled out 2 silver-colored wrappings. He offered one to Wyatt, who took it eyebrow raised, then snapped his open, revealing a gray ration. Wyatt opened his and found the same ration bar, but it wasn't like any other he'd ever seen. Ration bars were usually green, brown, or yellow, and they smelled of dry chemicals, not to mention the taste was not good but not terrible either. The bar in his hands had no smell and looked dry and wet at the same time. "You've been eating poorly," Milcades said, abruptly ending the silence between them. "I've taken my rations as intended," Wyatt countered. "Yes, you have, but it's not enough, is it? You don't eat anything between your rationed meals, do you?" Milcades asked, though his question sounded more like an affirmation. "I eat a lakshoa from time to time, also the sweets Princess Clara shares with me," he admitted. "Is that not enough?" "You need to eat more. Those insects, the lakshoa, Cynthia says that they are rich in proteins. Eat more of those or a ration or protein bar between meals from now on. The upgrades and implants you received will burn out your body if you don't nourish your body correctly, Wyatt. You've been hungry for days, haven't you?" "How do you—" Wyatt stammered, and his stomach chose that moment to growl. Shutting his mouth, he tried to not look embarrassed by the betrayal of his body. Milcades laughed gently, showing a toothy grin. "Clara and Cynthia don't know about it, right? I think Cynthia suspects, but she's not terribly observant of the little details like that. Unless you're Clara. In that case, she'll count every gram of food you eat and every drop of water you drink." He barked another short laugh. "It has been manageable," Wyatt replied after a few seconds of silence. "Hunger is not new to me." Milcades shrugged. "Perhaps not, but malnourishment is an entirely different beat. So eat up and fill your belly. Though only eat half of it. Save the other half for tomorrow or wherever you want. Damn things don't rot for years," he said, before taking a rather crunchy bite from his ration bar. Wyatt swallowed a ball of spit before following Milcades' instruction. With a crunchy and satisfying bite, he munched on the bar, and instantly his eyes widened. He had to make use of his entire force of will to not spit out the morsel he'd eaten. Tears filled his eyes, and he gave Milcades a pledging stare. The taste was, to put it mildly, beyond awful. "You get used to it," Milcades commented with his playful grin. "What you're tasting is a rich and heavily concentrated pack of minerals, vitamins, protein, and other supplements, all mixed up in an easily packed and foul-tasting meal that gives your body everything it needs, except for the flavor." Defeated, the pilot gave difficult after difficult munch until the taste wasn't as awful and he could swallow it. With some apprehension, he took a second bite and then a third and a fourth, eating half of it and storing the rest for later consumption, just as Milcades suggested. By the time he was done, Milcades had eaten his bar and smacked his lips curiously. "At one point you'd think you'll get used to the aftertaste, but you never do," commented the Royal Marine with a finishing chuckle. "I'm surprised you didn't throw up." "I was very tempted," Wyatt replied, as the yucky aftertaste clung to his palate, tongue, and throat, refusing to leave him just yet. "Ha! I bet!" Milcades laughed. As Milcades laughed, Wyatt tried to comprehend the situation he was in. He'd only heard and seen the captain carry himself with diligence and stoicism, but now he was sitting next to a Royal Marine captain openly laughing and being so merry, jovial even. It was unsettling in a positive sense, as he felt no tension between the two of them. "Thank you, Milcades. I'll take your advice to heart," Wyatt replied once the white-haired man stopped laughing. "Make sure that you do. Clara would be saddened if her favorite pilot is not eating properly and becomes feeble." He chuckled and waved a hand dismissingly. "Speaking of weakness, Wyatt, I've observed your training regime with Cynthia outside our own shooting practices, and I must say she is a tough teacher, but you are an adept student. Albeit, and do forgive me for being crass, you are a complete idiot." "Pardon?" Wyatt asked, taken aback by the insult that carried no ill will behind it. "How am I being an idiot?" "You," Milcades continued, pointing a finger at the pilot as his eyes were fixated on him, "only do what she's telling you to do, with almost no flair of your own into the mix. A shame, I must say. Those glimpses of brilliance are obscured by blind obedience." "You're one to talk about blind obedience, but you're not wrong either," Wyatt thought, frowning. "I don't understand what you mean by that. I've only followed the instructions Cynthia has given me." "Precisely. Cynthia is rigid, methodical, and relentless. Once she has a target, there is no force in the principality that's capable of stopping her. For a Royal Marine and other Aster agents, that sort of training works fine. But on you, it is almost sad to witness," Milcades explained. "Cynthia is not a bad teacher," Wyatt said, jumping to the defense of his friend. "Oh, she most certainly is not. But while she can teach you is vast and useful, you are not well suited to learn it how she expects you to learn it." Milcades brought up his left hand, crumpled into a fist while his right was open. "She's a rock. You're paper. The more she grinds on you, the more torn up you'll become." "But everything she's teaching me is for Clara's sake. I need to be strong and capable in order to stand next to her. I can take a beating if that's all it takes to become what Clara needs me to be," Wyatt countered. "And that right there is the problem. Clara doesn't want you to be just another bodyguard, Wyatt. Trust me, I've known her since she was a child, and what she needs the most is you for who you are. She needs a true friend like Cynthia is, but different than her. She needs not another loyal dog, but a loyal friend. There's a difference, my friend." "I wouldn't know about friends, Milcades," Wyatt said, his gaze distant for a moment. "But then why train me at all if Clara doesn't desire me to become a guardian of hers? I'm a knight banneret of House Aster. Isn't that what I'm supposed to be?" Milcades shrugged. "On paper, yes. In practice, it depends. Regardless of anything, you're willing to protect her, don't you?" "Yes," he replied immediately. Despite what he wished to discuss with her, he would protect her with all of his ability, with his life if need be. She was an Aster, the princess he served under, but most importantly, his friend. He would do the same for Cynthia, even if she didn't need any protection he could offer. Milcades' lips curled into a wide smile. "Then take Cynthia's training and apply your best attributes to it. Be Wyatt Staples. She's a rock, a mountain, rigid, unmoving. You are paper, flexible and malleable. Use that, Wyatt." "I will try, Milcades," Wyatt replied, showcasing a smile of his own. The oddly jovial spirit of the captain was not only infectious but welcome. He had expected the man to be a brooding and unfeeling killing machine. He was pleasantly proven wrong and showed that Royal Marines, for all their reputation, stories, and deeds, were just human like the rest of them. Dangerous, powerful, and the best warriors the Principality could produce, but undeniably human. Clapping his hands, Milcades stood up and placed the suitcase on the bed. "I ask for nothing more, Wyatt. My gift of words has ended, now come the other gifts," he exclaimed with fanfare before unlocking the suitcase to reveal two identical black handguns resting inside the suitcase. Wyatt stared at the beautiful handguns, the magazines resting at the edges of the suitcase, and his heraldic shield engraved on their barrels. Captivated by the sleek but efficient design of the handguns, he reached for one and took it out of its protective casing, testing its weight. It was heavy, but lighter than the storm cannon. It also fitted his hand, although it was clear the grip was meant to be held whilst using his armor for optimal results. "It is beautiful," Wyatt said, unable to stop admiring the handgun. He had never been a gun enthusiast. He was just good with them. Few had been the times in which a gun captivated him as much as a fighter did. "Some adjustments had to be made, but work perfectly. Tested them myself," Milcades began. "They have been genetically linked to you, Wyatt. Only you can fire them. If anyone else tries, well, a nasty surprise awaits them. These are RMG V-22 Soul Snatchers. They fire reinforced tungsten-tipped bullets that are partially ionized as they are propelled through the barrel, enough to rapidly deplete shields or punch through weaker ones. The bullets are also armor-piercing and have an effective range of 50 meters. Though the further the target is, the less effective the shield-breaking charge will be. You can choose to activate or deactivate the shield-breaking charge at will, but due to its modifications, it can only hold enough charge for 30 shots. Each magazine holds 25 bullets, and you can restock them freely here in the Nornavio. RMG, Royal Marine Grade. No wonder they looked familiar. Cynthia and the other Royal Marines carry similar handguns, but yours are bulkier," Wyatt said, only partially surprised to receive something only meant for Royal Marines. "Quite so. Although your Soul Snatchers are streamlined to reduce their weight at the cost of a much more limited charge capacity, the punch remains the same. Use them wisely, Wyatt Staples. It is thanks to your actions at Woodshaft that ensured the safety and survival of an Aster. On behalf of the Royal Marines, we give unto you a show of our appreciation." Milcades stood firmly and saluted the lieutenant. "Loyalty is its own reward." Wyatt set down the handgun, putting it back inside the suitcase alongside its twin, and stood up, returning the salute to the white-haired man. "Loyalty is its own reward," he said, his heart beating loudly. Starting today, I'll be releasing new chapters of The Black Ship a few hours before their YouTube premiere. If you're one of my Patreon supporters, you'll get exclusive early access to watch the latest episodes on Patreon first. So instead of waiting for the usual release time, you can enjoy the episode early.